Hey everyone, hope you're doing alright out there. This video has been a long time coming as I originally got this as a gift for over the holidays towards the end of last year, but being such a massive game and having a lot less time than I used to for gaming myself, I didn't actually finish this game for the first time until just a few days ago, and I really wanted to do a review on it. Now, spoiler warning for the thesis of this video, but yeah, you should absolutely play this game and I highly recommend it. So let's go. Now obviously, while I don't have a physical copy myself, I still think it's pretty neat to look up the original box art and guidebook. They're small, underappreciated details in selling a game. Starting with the manual, and this might be my favorite manual since the Sly Cooper trilogy. The art style makes it feel straight out of the world itself, and I love when developers go the extra mile and add tons of world building and extra flavor beyond like the just dry important info for controls, mechanics, and so on. The Arcanum guide is an astounding 183 pages, so it would take me several hours to go over everything that is in there, but I would highly recommend reading it and using this as your primary resource for playing through the game, honestly. I know the modern day tendency is to look things up whenever you have any questions, but I found that using this instead really let me have like a good balance of finding things out for myself while still never having moments where I felt lost after reading the player guide still. And the box art, my goodness, genuinely perfect. It encapsulates the vibe of a medieval fantasy world going through a Victorian age with the Zeppelin, train, tattooed elf, mage, and castle surrounded by greenery, and just all of this over this big gear shape is just magnificent design language. It captures everything in the setting itself as well as the game's depth and complexity beautifully. Just awesome stuff. While there are less than 10 minutes of cinematics in total within the game, they are very deliberately used, written, and directed, adding immense value to the overall atmosphere of the game. I love how it starts with this old school title card that makes me think of the silent film era way back in the day that I've only really seen in film classes and stuff I took in high school. Also, I don't know what it is, but there's just something visually about the late 90s and early 2000s 3D cutscenes that is just so visually engaging. I don't know what it is, but cutscenes in all pre-Bethesda Fallout games, even Tactics, and the cutscenes in Panzer Dragoon Saga, and this game just have this similar look I can't describe, but I love it. Sort of like how all Unity-made games have like a similar look, especially in trailers, if you get what I'm trying to say. Also, the sound design was lovely. The intro has my favorite song in the soundtrack, and everything from the flying in airplane fighters to the chatter on the Zeppelin sounds really good. Yeah, wow, what a great intro to grab your attention really quickly. In less than 2 minutes, we've learned we were just aboard the first Zeppelin, and that we got attacked by possibly the first fighter planes in what is certainly the first air combat in this world's history, as well as the first attack on a civilian aircraft in this world's history. So yeah, a lot of firsts. And we're also having a bunch of engaging questions come to mind immediately. Why was the ship attacked? Who sent the fighter planes? Were they ordered to destroy themselves to take down the Zeppelin at any cost, or are they just bad flyers? What will be the international response to this, if any, from this attack? And the wreckage, my goodness. This was a game released all the way back in 2001, and there are modern AAA releases that have less attention to detail than this. Well done. We get even more questions to chew on during this guy's dialogue. What's the boy that he's talking about? Why is that important? Who is the guy that he was looking for? Was anybody looking for him? What did he do? Who is this guy even? Now, all of these questions and the questions from earlier parts of the intro cutscene have players with multiple high stakes and engaging threads to follow in their mind if they so wish, rather than like a traditional one focus type of narrative. I just, yeah, love the intro cutscenes. Easy 10 out of 10 here. I'll just let the rest of it play here real quick without interrupting. Tim Kaine cited this, in particular having a rich class-free creation system is one of the design pillars on Arcanum, and it really shows. Between the general skills, magical skills, and technological skills, in addition to the varying personal attributes and traits, the character creation is just loads of fun. This is one of those types of games where it takes a lot of discipline to complete a playthrough with a character before you've started up several more. Not because the late game is unengaging, but rather just because creation is that fun. Given the nature of isometric games, on an appearance level, character creation aesthetically is definitely surpassed by other RPGs I've played, but overall mechanics tend to be more important to me than looks, and if you agree with that sentiment to any extent, then you'll quickly adore this aspect of the game. Rather than going through the entire story beat by beat, as that's already been done on several videos on this platform, let's just go over a broad overview of how my playthrough went. I decided to start with playing a sword-wielding technological elf that sided with magical people when possible, and in particular, whenever I read a solution as positive for environment, I vehemently sided with that. Both Virgil and Raven were my two main followers throughout the campaign, and they were both magic users, which had the benefit of giving us a diversity in ways our party can deal damage. However, there were a few challenges, like Virgil's spells no longer working on me, which made keeping up my health in the late game significantly harder than in the early game. I also feel like in hindsight that melee weapon builds are just better combined with magic than tech. During my research for this video, I realized I actually missed out on a lot of the best melee weapons because they're mostly magical, and obviously my character being so technological couldn't use magic at all. Thankfully, since I invested in my charisma, most of my magically inclined allies and all that tolerated my tinkering and technical aptitude, thank goodness. And in spite of my magical incompetence, with a lot of work, I managed to revive Virgil after he, does the whole thing where he goes off on his own and sadly gets killed by a bunch of thieves while away, which I was able to bring him back, but at a much reduced level, which was also part of the reason why I ended up recruiting Raven to join the party in the first place. I eventually got to the Void and saved everyone there besides Krakator. He was just being a little bit of a shithead. And then ultimately when confronted with Kurgan, and after fighting through all of the guards, it felt most appropriate for the character I was playing through to not go with the non-combative option for once, as previous to that point I'd been trying to persuade people as much as possible rather than fight them. But with Kurgan, I decided to fight him. While other characters I play in the future are of course going to go with the different options at the ending, like I said, I just felt it made sense for this nature-preserving but tech-optimistic character I was role-playing to sort of strongly disagree with Kurgan's worldview. So let's go over some general RPG categories and give Arcanum scores on a scale of 0 to 10 for how much I enjoyed each of these aspects. To give a frame of reference for these scores, here is what I gave Skyrim, my 27th favorite overall game as well as my 8th favorite RPG, and Fallout 2, my 21st favorite game and 7th favorite overall RPG on each category. A 0 means something actively detracted from my enjoyment of the game, a 1 means I don't care about it either way, and everything above that is varying scales of enjoyment, with roughly 5 being my best estimate for a quote-unquote average RPG score for me in each. Yes, this means on average I consider RPGs more fun than not in every single one of these 19 aspects. Call me a naive optimist, but personally I feel most games tend to do most things right, actually. So overall, to give it a ranking for character creation, I would give it a 9 out of 10 because, as mentioned earlier, mechanics tend to be more important than looks for me, but looks are a part of character creation, and that's definitely something that, of course, being an isometric game from 2001 is definitely lacking, something that a lot of other games that I've played, especially RPGs, have done a lot better. But mechanically, it is so thorough and just so great. I absolutely love it, so 9 out of 10 there. Of course, since there's so many options, it's impossible to use every skill in one playthrough, and I'm recording this just after finishing my first playthrough, and I'm not too far into my second one, and I haven't experienced for myself what would have been like, obviously, to play different species, or play as a mage, and so on. However, based on everything I've been able to understand through my research and playtime, it has to earn a solid 10 in this category. Quite frankly, with how divided it is, and progressive it just feels very similar to how I run my own homebrew campaigns. I mean, I genuinely can't think of any complaints, only more ideas, like giving us even more skills to use, which clearly shows I'm enthusiastic and positive about it. Setting on a geographic level admittedly leaves me wanting more, particularly when it comes to the map. I would like to see some coasts with fjords and stuff, not just this smooth coastline all over the place, which isn't as visually interesting, in addition to, for a lack of a better term, making the shapes of the island feel less natural looking. Like outside of a peninsula on Thanatos or two, what else is really going on in the islands? Nothing. Also, where the mountains head straight into the sea here should have some islands down there, or better yet, just nudge Catan, or Catan, not sure how you pronounce it, southwest and have some smaller mountains in the middle of it, thus indicating like the mountain chain is ending and giving the island some more unique topography. However, on a climactic level, I like what they did. A lot of variety, and each climate makes sense in relation to the other one surrounding it. So on every other level outside of Geography Nerd Dreams, the setting of this D&D fantasy setting through an industrial age is just absolutely stellar and very inspired. So despite all my nitpicking, this is actually another 9 out of 10 for me category. When it comes to capitalizing on that interesting setting through giving folks like me enough world-building substance to chew on, this is another category Arcanum fulfills all my dreams in. From the politics during playthroughs, to the history, to the liveliness of the world. The fun just touches everything, and it really brings it all together, and it makes it feel really believable, like the newspapers and all this sort of little details. Speaking of which, seeing Tim Kane's show like an actual physical one they made for the press just put the biggest smile on my face. Like, yeah, little things like that just really help you as a viewer connect with and understand the genuine passion of the development team. 10 out of 10. On paper, the main story should be right up my alley. Negotiation, diverging paths, plot twists, people pulling the strings behind the scenes, entire places that are mysterious as hell even to the people in the world of this game. But in practice, I just don't think enough seeds were planted earlier in the game to have the player thinking about things like the afterlife, eternal suffering, peace, and so on, or have the pondering of those questions feel like what the payoff was looking for, which is sort of antithetical to what the main villain at the end is doing. Like, for example, the main themes of the original Fallout games, this sort of retro melancholic lens on civilization will have you thinking about questions related to those of the Master, like, how does humanity find a future in this post-apocalyptic waste? Can the world ever go back to a way it was before the war? And just from the beginning to end, that philosophical lens of putting the afterlife in Arcanum just isn't really something I ever once considered until towards the end. And that was only when the game directly asked me about it. And so therefore I didn't really have a response I felt strongly in, because I hadn't really gotten a chance to develop my character's relationship with the concept. But with all that said, however, it pulls off everything else rather well, especially when it comes to the political intrigue around Aranax. That's really well done, so I'd say a 6 out of 10 overall. Honestly, the soundtrack is just wonderful. Much like the Order 1886, it is heavily string dominated, yet manages to, through melodies and clever tricks, keep looping songs audibly engaging for the player, which is certainly no easy feat. Tola and the Mines both come close, as I like those as my second and third favorite songs in the whole track, but personally I think this one, Demise of the Zephyr, is my favorite. So yeah, pretty good. The only two reasons I'm giving it an 8 instead of a 10 are the lack of variety in the instrumentation does feel slightly limiting to what the soundtrack could have been at its absolute best. And then unlike, say, Metallic Monks in Fallout or Tower in Halo Infinite, I don't hear anything that feels so unique it like blows my socks off, you know what I'm saying? But still a pretty damn respectable 8 out of 10, in particular given how well most RPG soundtracks tend to be. Most of them tend to really knock it out of the park. The dichotomy with the art style for me is even more pronounced than with the music. On the one hand, enemies, items, schematics, and basically anything other than the buildings in the overworld looks visually interesting and super freaking cool. But for top-down games like this, the original Fallouts, Hades, and so on, they just never have as good-looking worlds that make me want to explore them just for like the sights of it as other games do for myself personally, at least, no matter how many similar perspective games I try. So while there's no individual piece of art for the game I could point to and say, that's something I don't like, when you see screenshots of areas compared to like towns and others, like even other top-down isometrics games such as old school RuneScape for example, it just doesn't look as interesting to me overall. I know that's sort of vague, but basically everything other than the overworld looks pretty good, so I'd give it a 7 out of 10. I know a lot of critique has been thrown at the combat, but controversially, I actually appreciate the ability to have both real-time and turn-based options. It really allows me as a player to have greater control of pacing the game, and honestly, if there were just a few slight adjustments to make real-time like 5% less stressful, this would easily be one of my top 5 favorite combat systems of all time. Just sadly, due to the balancing and ferocity, it can almost feel like the game is trying to push you away like actively from the real-time combat, even when engaged with in small doses, which is what I did during my playthrough. Which is a shame, but nothing catastrophic for me, so 8 out of 10 here. A lot of weapon variety, a lot of different options in every single situation. Just sort of the mix system had a lot of potential that got missed in my opinion. Well, I sort of touched on earlier how games with Arcanum's isometric style and perspective tend to have, like on a visual level, worlds I find less engaging than other types of games. Given how expansive the world is, how rich it is with things to do, and the climate variety, I actually found myself at several points in the game going out into the world just to explore the wilderness for fun. And that's like genuinely a first for me. No other isometric game I've ever played that way can say that, and so that makes it at least a solid 7 out of 10 in this category for me. Outside of me having some differing opinions on how the main story was paced, which really only came up during my last few hours of my playthrough, how this game allows you to pace your personal ideal balance of combat, dialogue, exploration, questing, and each of those just sort of working within one another is something I was really impressed with. For example, Fort Joy and Divinity Original Sin 2, and like the starting sequence of Oblivion were like both not really well paced in my opinion, and they dragged on far too long even in my first playthroughs of each for my liking, and then both of which also felt really repetitive on repeat playthroughs, thus making it just kind of feel like a boring zone on my first and subsequent playthroughs. But I don't ever remember feeling that way in Arcanum. I always felt like I had plenty of options. I felt like those options were always adequately varied enough, and regardless of if I'm like just being hyper focused on exploring the wilderness like I talked about earlier, or went to a new city, or try to take on all the variety of tasks to do at once, it never felt like individual beats dragged on for too long or were abruptly cut too short, which is something that's really hard to describe in concrete terms and is obviously going to massively depend on the player preference. But overall, I really liked it. Not 10 out of 10, I'd say 9 out of 10. As a writer myself, I am massively impressed with the factions, how they are represented, how they interact with the world, and even just how they carry themselves in general. I mean, from how the railroads treat people, to the spell colleges, to the Panari Church, and how that integrates and influences society. Like, in hindsight, I wish I had mentioned in my Order 1886 retrospective that if the writing team needed a good showcase of how to write factions in a Victorian setting, they had a perfect example in this game. I can't remember which video it is exactly, but Tim Kaine talked about how much research went into Arcanum and the factions, especially like that reflects really that well in my opinion.
That's why I dug up. I actually wrote a document that I found in my many notes called Victorian Times. I wrote this. I started writing this in 98. The last time I touched it looks like September 2000. What I did is I even said, this document lists the prevailing social and environmental issues during the Victoria era. This era is defined as 1837 through 1901, the reign of Queen Victoria in Great Britain. This era was represented by such 19th century ideals as devotion to family life, public and private responsibility, and obedience to law. The prevalent morals, manners, and tastes have been described as prudish, narrow, pompous, hypocritical, ornate, and eclectic. And Arcanum will explore many of those stereotypes. It goes on for 6-8 pages.
With that said, however, I don't think I could justify giving the factions in Arcanum a perfect 10 out of 10 because while I certainly sided with some factions more than others in the game, I don't think I ever fully enthusiastically fell in love with any faction. I like them all, but to give some examples of what I'm talking about, in Fallout New Vegas I thought the Enclave armor looked so cool that I immediately decided no matter what, I was siding with them and doing their quest to roleplay a character closely connected with the faction. If we had ever gotten Van Buren, the Daughters of Hecate in the design document sounded super interesting. This basically authoritarian, paganistic matriarchy founded by someone saved by this old computer that abandoned its task to be this sort of ultimate caregiver figure. That'd be something I'd be so hyped about. In Daggerfall, despite not talking a lot or doing much outside of communicating with the Daedra, the Witches' Covens, with them being unmarked on the map, their aesthetic design and just general presence in the lore of the game was so captivating that I immediately started role-playing as a traveling member of the Witches' Coven, with a giddy smile on my face and all that. Or even in Skyrim, despite not liking any college members outside of Tolfdir and J'zargo, the College of Winterhold has just such a cool setting on the cliffs and with this awesome architecture that I oftentimes love role-playing an Archmage at the college. I can't cite any comparable moments of enthusiasm for any faction in Arcanum, sadly, though. But as stated earlier, outside of that, I was very happy, so I'd say 8 out of 10. Honestly, I don't feel I have anything interesting to say here. There are games with much worse game markets, like in the Panzer Dragoon Saga, in which there basically is none, and this isn't like that. However, likewise, it doesn't feel as integral and integrated as, say, that of New Vegas, with the traveling caravans and certain market areas that make sense for the specific location, in addition to it being a big help with getting and upgrading gear. Arcanum certainly fulfills the latter aspect pretty well, but not so much the former, so I'd say a balanced 5 out of 10. Simply put, every single follower in this game has excellent writing. When I saw how many possible ones there are, I really wasn't expecting every single character. I mean, obviously Raven and Virgil were the two that I went with the most, but even more honestly, they were just all individually and collectively so much fun. And you would expect, there are games in which there's only a fifth of this quantity of followers to choose from. For example, as much as I love Original Sin 2, the followers in this game, Arcanum, are just as exciting as those in Original Sin 2, despite having over 5 times as many options as Divinity. 9 out of 10, and if I can ever figure out how to get Virgil to stop wasting his bloody magic, it will quickly become a 10 out of 10, honestly. Quite simply and straight to the point here, since I got this game in December of last year, I would say at least 85% of my time spent gaming since has been just playing Arcanum. And I started my second playthrough the same day that I finally finished my first after a few months. So sadly, I don't have as much time to game as I used to, as I mentioned earlier, or else I'd probably be on my 4th or 5th playthrough at this point. So that should probably indicate how I feel about this. Ranking replayability anything lower than a 10 would be just lying to myself. So yeah, 10 out of 10 here. This is yet another easy 10 out of 10 category. If you thought like me, the original Fallout games had some of the most enjoyable weapon sandboxes in an RPG, trust me when I say Arcanum has that level of choice and then some. Not only do you have guns, throwing weapons, and gauntlets, but you also get axes, maces, hammers, swords, bows, and even apparently 80 different spells. Admittedly, I've only just started my second playthrough and my first character didn't know any magic, as I talked about earlier, so I had to look that last one up to find out exactly how many there are. So yeah, I've only scratched the surface of the spell system in the game. Wow. Much like the spell system, I've only scratched the surface when it comes to how many side quests there are in this game. I'm only around 10 hours at most, maybe, into my second playthrough, but I've gone across the world in the same order as I did with my first character. And outside of the main quest, like, I went through the same exact locations and genuinely entirely different tasks. I mean, in both playthroughs, I've easily spent like an hour in Kintara and that sort of area around there, and I can't think of anything both characters did exactly the same outside of the main story, as I mentioned. So for those reasons, it's about a 9 out of 10, I think. There are a small handful of games whose side questing I enjoy more, such as The Witcher 3, but Arcanum certainly has enjoyment to be had in this category, even more so than the majority of RPGs out there. Just due to how much lore there is in this game, this score is most subsequent to change over time potentially. But with that said, I genuinely can't think of a single internal lore contradiction. This isn't Skyrim, where the lore at several points in the series relating to the Thuum, climate of the province, and the very existence of settlements beforehand were just blatantly contradicted in Elder Scrolls V. Now granted, it is a lot easier to do this with the first installment of an IP than like a fifth main line in a several decades old franchise of RPGs, but as seen with my Order 1886 retrospective, you can definitely make a new IP and easily have several internal contradictions within the lore of the very first game that hinders immersion. How close to real-world physics isn't what determines that, but rather when you set a rule, like, say, dragon type in Pokemon is super effective against other dragon types, for examples. All interactions subsequently within the game itself should abide by those precedents. So in our Pokemon example, it would be a big problem if randomly 1 in every 10 dragon type moves could just never do super effective damage against other pure dragon types. Arcanum yet again doesn't miss a beat here, so 10 out of 10. As partially talked about when I broke down the first half of the intro cutscene earlier, the cinematography in the cutscenes is just stellar here. Short but very potent and deliberate. Seriously, go watch them on YouTube if you haven't already. Yet another 10 out of 10 in this aspect. Okay, so the menu is great and looks good and has everything you need on it, but the game UI admittedly is not very intuitive for me. I would say almost half of the time I needed to reference the player manual or player guide. It was just because I was confused or because I didn't remember how to do something or had no idea what several buttons on my screen did. This is one of the few aspects of the game that I was disappointed by. Still, I have seen far worse, and again, the main menu has none of those complaints really, so let's say a 1 out of 10 here. It's not a 0, it doesn't actively detract from my enjoyment of the game, but it certainly doesn't contribute anything either, admittedly. So here's all the scores in each category, giving Arcanum a total of 155 out of a possible 190 points. I can't recommend this game enough, especially to players interested in deep world building and or RPGs in general. Quite frankly, even if it was a fully priced modern release game, I'd still suggest it. You can literally get this for $1 and some change actually until the 21st of March on Steam, which is how I got it. Or if you are watching this after that date has passed, it's okay. Because guess what? The previous price before the deal was only $5.99. So financially, it is a very accessible game, which is lovely. So yeah, that's pretty much everything I had to say about my first playthrough. I do writing and art commissions. My email for that is in the description, as well as the channel's Twitter. Love you all, and take care.